In April 1945, the northern part of Germany had already lost its former geometric lines on the map. Roads, churned up again and again by continuous rain and tank tracks, had turned into mud where no contours could be recognized, and the trees were forced to lean in the same direction, as if trying to avoid the sound of artillery fire rumbling in the distance. The entire supply line resembled a grey vein drained of blood, sustained only by scattered infantry convoys that kept its last breaths going. Well water in the countryside carried the taste of scorched earth. Sediment in army canteens grew thicker by the day, and the air was filled with dampness and mould, as if everything was slowly rotting. For the German front line and its logistical system, the true collapse did not take place on the battlefield, but began with the disintegration of the most basic aspects of everyday life: water, fuel, soap, clean clothing. Things that were once the most ordinary elements of human civilization had become unattainable luxuries in that spring. In this ruined environment, the female auxiliary personnel, the Blitzmädchen, took on duties that had been forced to stretch far beyond their original scope. After being reorganized, they were sent to positions that were ever closer to the front, responsible for communication lines, vehicle dispatch, weather measurements, and, when necessary, even battlefield tallying tasks. They had never been trained to work in conditions without water, without electricity, and knee-deep in mud, yet every day they had to squeeze into damp dugouts and complete shifts of more than 10 hours, while wearing uniforms that had not fully dried for a long time. At the same time, there was the American supply system. Despite the ocean that separated it from the front, material continued to flow steadily to the Western Front, and truck convoys, supported by petroleum and a maintenance infrastructure, were kept running continuously. The sanitation rules in American prisoner-of-war camps were enforced strictly in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Every prisoner had to bathe regularly, undergo health inspections, be issued cleaning supplies, and keep his or her living quarters in order. In essence, these regulations arose from logistical capacity rather than benevolence, which is why they were implemented with precision in areas far from the front. It was precisely this institutional stability that planted an unexpected turning point in Anna's fate. One day in mid-April, the communications unit Anna belonged to received orders to withdraw. The light trucks that had originally been used to transport cables and radios moved with difficulty along the damaged country road, their tailgates not fully closed. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and gasoline, and the engine stalled several times, almost going out. Just as the convoy was trying to bypass a landslide, the outlines of an American mechanized column suddenly appeared on the hillside to the south. Grey-green armored vehicles advanced slowly out of the woods, their tracks pressing firm lines into the earth, in stark contrast to the German vehicles that always seemed on the verge of overturning. From a loudspeaker came the order for them to halt, get out, and raise their hands. She had never seen the kind of neat, square-printed lines that appeared on American prisoner-of-war registration forms, and she could not understand why the medical NCOs wore rubber gloves to inspect mouths and fingernails. She watched the male prisoners in front of her being issued towels, clean clothing, and a pale bar of soap. There were fine grooves carved into the soap, and the damp air brought out a faint, unfamiliar fragrance from its surface. The first time she smelled that scent, she did not relax. Instead, her whole body tensed. She thought it was some kind of hint laden with hidden insult, a way of disguising a humiliating procedure behind an ordinary object. She had heard too many versions of similar stories in propaganda and had never doubted the truth of those rumors. On the way to the temporary camp where she was being escorted, she continued to stumble along the muddy road, rainwater dripping constantly from the brim of her cap and seeping into the underlayer that had long since been soaked through. In the distance, the barbed wire of the camp came into view, and a few dim bulbs shone on the wooden sign at the entrance. Anna saw the prisoners in line being led one by one into a shower room, each with that same pale bar of soap in hand. She was certain that when it was her turn, that bar of soap would become an instrument of humiliation. She even prepared herself for the worst outcome, her breathing turning rapid and her chest feeling as if a hard object were pressing down on it. Then the line moved forward, and it was her turn. An American NCO lowered his head to check her number, reached into a wooden crate for a bar of soap, and held it up in front of her. In that instant, she almost expected him to show a mocking expression or use some suggestive gesture to make fun of her. But his face was completely expressionless, as if he were merely repeating an utterly ordinary procedure. He simply placed the soap into her palm and then turned to the next person. Anna froze. Dampness, exhaustion, fear, the smell of earth and sweat, all these blended together, and she found herself unable to make sense of what was happening before her. She was certain the humiliation had not yet begun, and that the soap was only the first step. She gripped the bar of soap so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and with heavy steps she walked toward the shower room. She did not know that the true breakdown was already waiting for her there. The shower room stood among a row of temporary wooden huts on the eastern side of the camp, and the ground outside its door had been churned by rain and footprints into dark brown mud. The outer walls of the huts were slightly warped from prolonged dampness, as if they might collapse at any moment. Yet inside, the sound from the pipes maintained a steady rhythm, like some strange mechanical breathing. Anna stood at the entrance, the pale bar of soap in her hand soaked by the rain, her fingers stiff from cold and tension, almost unable to keep their grip. She watched the prisoners ahead of her go inside as steam poured out from the crack of the door, carrying the warmth of the water, a sharp contrast to the clammy chill that had clung to her coat for so long. She could not understand why bathing would appear as part of the daily routine in a military camp, nor could she believe that such treatment would be extended to a female auxiliary soldier who had only just been taken prisoner. When her turn came and she stepped into the hut, her first reaction was still to hunch her shoulders. A few bare bulbs overhead cast a weak light onto peeling wall panels. The floor was laid with rinsed stone slabs, and a few soaked towels lay piled in the corners. Several showerheads were arranged in neat rows along the opposite wall, and water streamed continuously from each of them, the temperature steady and unchanging, unlike the kind of water she had grown used to in recent years, briefly warm and then instantly turning cold. Anna stared at the jets of water, not daring to approach, as if taking one more step would trigger some irreversible outcome. Her superiors and her training had repeatedly warned her never to trust the outward behavior of the enemy. Now, a clean shower room, a stable water supply, and a fragrant bar of soap seemed less like a privilege and more like a carefully constructed prelude to humiliation. She slowly extended her hand and tentatively touched the stream of water. The moment the warm water fell onto her palm, she gasped softly. Not because the temperature was too high, but because she had not felt this kind of warmth in her memory for so long that it belonged almost to another life. The grime on her hand dissolved immediately, flowing between her fingers like a heavy, unfamiliar shell being shed. She watched the droplets slide down her skin, as if seeing her own hands for the first time. The bar of soap was still in her grasp. Its surface, soaked by rain and sweat, released a faint scent that seemed completely out of place in this world. It was a citrus fragrance, gentle and fresh, like fruit on a kitchen windowsill in summer, or like a holiday morning she had long since forgotten. She searched her memory for the source of that smell, and realized she had not truly encountered anything scented for 3 full years. 3 years spent in communication bunkers, in temporary barracks, in air raid shelters, along a supply line that had been completely exhausted. She had known only the smell of smoke, oil, damp cloth, and the acrid staleness of sweat, layered again and again into the fabric at her collar. The bar of soap felt as if it had fallen into her hand from another world. She held the soap under the stream of water and rubbed it gently. Foam spread out at once. For a moment she went rigid with surprise. The foam was white and fine, not the coarse lather forced from hard water and poor-quality ash, but white bubbles that were truly capable of cleaning the skin, light and full of air. She smoothed the foam across the back of her hand, and the soft touch made her almost want to pull her hand away because that sensation was so alien to her. It was so unfamiliar that it gave her a feeling of violating reality itself. She did not know why she suddenly thought of her life at the beginning of the war. At that time she had still been an apprentice clerk, washing her hands in the kitchen every morning, while her mother handed her a bar of soap bought in town and told her that being clean is part of being presentable. The scent of the soap then had been mild, yet it had been enough to make a young girl feel that the world was safe and could be managed. She had never imagined that 3 years later, another bar of soap would make it almost impossible for her to breathe. She slowly stepped under the stream of water, letting it fall onto her shoulders, her back, her hair. The flow washed away the dirt that had accumulated at her collar, ran down along her spine, and carried off the clammy, sticky feel of her skin. She closed her eyes, and her chest felt as if it had been struck hard by something blunt. She suddenly realized that for 3 years she had never truly experienced what the word clean was supposed to mean. It was not the act of splashing her face a few times, nor the hurried rinsing with cold water, but a thorough, genuine cleanliness that spread from every inch of her skin to the depths of her awareness. The sound of the water over her head drummed on without pause, like a kind of reset ritual. Her breathing began to tremble and quicken beyond her control. She tried to calm herself, but the tightness in her chest only increased. Suddenly she seemed to lose her strength, bracing herself against the wall as her forehead rested against the cold wooden boards. For the first time she was not tense in order to survive, but because she was trying to understand what she was now experiencing. This was not humiliation, not mockery, not a sign of some impending disaster. This was, after the 3 hardest years in Europe, the first time she had been allowed to become a person again. She ran the soap lightly along her forearm, and a patch of skin immediately appeared brighter than the surrounding area. She was stunned by this simple change. She had no idea when she herself had become so darkened, so much like a fragment stained by the colors of war. She rubbed again, and that bright patch became even more distinct, its edges clean and soft. Her hand began to tremble, and the soap nearly slipped from between her fingers. She suddenly thought of nights spent withdrawing from the front, of her fingertips smudged with ash as she stayed up in the communication bunker, of the uniforms that never dried during the rainy season, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the rawness of skin rubbed raw beneath wet cloth. Those memories had long since gone numb, but now they surged back like a flood, making this ordinary shower room feel unreal. She understood that this was not a courtesy granted by the Americans, nor some symbolic favor, but merely a standard procedure in a vast industrial system. And yet it was precisely this simplicity to the point of coldness that so easily pulled her a small step away from the mire of war. Her emotional breakdown did not happen in an instant. It was more like being slowly dissolved. Her shoulders began to shake, her breath came in broken spurts, and sounds built up in her throat, as if trying to burst through some sealed barrier. She tried to lift her head, but her tears and the water mingled, leaving her unable to tell what was making the world blur. The sobs she had been holding back finally spilled out, at first as short gasps and then as tremors she could no longer restrain. She covered her mouth with her hand, but her body continued to shake. In that moment, she realized for the first time that civilization was not grand buildings, powerful armies, or magnificent ceremonies, but whether a person could have clean skin, could smell fragrance, could feel warmth in the steam around her. And in this war, she had somehow forgotten these most basic sensations. The boundary between civilization and barbarity was not the front line, but whether a person could still remain anything like a human being. She was crying so hard she could barely stand, half kneeling in the shower as the soap slipped from her hand and struck the stone floor with a dull thud. She watched it slide to her feet, and a nearly absurd fear rose in her chest. If it were washed away, she would no longer be able to hold on to this brief world she had just entered. So she reached down and picked it up again, gripping it tightly like a slender rope that allowed her, if only for a moment, to rise above the war's quagmire. She had no idea how long she stood in the shower room. Warm water fell on her without pause. Foam slid down her arms, her neck, and her collarbones, and the sensation it brought made her hardly dare to believe it was real. Her tears blended with the water so that she could no longer tell hot from cold. At last, her body, which had been tense for so long, began to relax, like a piece of cloth that had been pulled taut for years and suddenly loosened. In that relaxation, she felt an enormous emptiness, and at the center of that emptiness there was, astonishingly, a bar of soap. Only when an NCO knocked on the door to remind her that her shower time was over did she slowly straighten up. She wiped the water from her face with a towel, but she could not wipe away the wave of emotion that had just overwhelmed her. When she stepped out of the hut, the air turned cold again. Damp wind brushed past her hair, but it no longer carried the deep, bone-chilling gloom it once had. For the first time, her skin felt light, and the cold wind seemed to be only wind, not a threat. Her steps were still heavy, but the weight now came more from her inability to digest what that bar of soap had done to her than from physical fatigue. She drew in a deep breath, and though the air was still filled with the mixed smells of smoke, oil, and earth, they no longer concealed the faint scent of citrus that clung to her body. That fragrance was weak and fragile, yet undeniably real. She had never imagined that one day she would recognize the fact that she was still alive simply because of the scent on her own body. She walked back to the line of prisoners. The expressions on the others' faces were tired and indifferent. Perhaps they had had similar experiences. Perhaps they had not. But for Anna, that bar of soap was not a simple cleaning tool. It was a fissure that had suddenly opened in her life. Through that narrow crack, she could see everything she had lost over the past 3 years, and could also see how the war had made people forget what they had once been. She had never imagined that civilization would return to her in this form, and even less that its first tangible touch would not be freedom, victory, or peace, but a small, pale bar of soap stacked in a wooden crate. From the next day on, life in the camp began to unfold at a rhythm completely different from anything she had known before. Time here was not dictated by the progress of the fighting, by air raids, or by orders, but by institutional routines. The morning bugle roused all prisoners from sleep, and the air still carried a damp chill, yet Anna noticed that when she sat up from her blanket for the first time, her body no longer felt the stabbing discomfort that long-term dampness had caused. Her skin was faintly tight, the feeling of having been truly cleaned. That unfamiliar sensation made her pause for a moment, as if she had not yet fully adapted to the state of being clean itself. The barracks were temporary wooden structures without any comfort to speak of, and the beds were as hard as untreated planks. Even so, compared with the days when she had slept on damp ground in dugouts, this already counted as stability. Roll call was short, mechanical, and devoid of emotion. The American soldiers carried out their duties with a composure that bordered on detachment. Their attitude was neither kind nor hostile, but a kind of neutrality that was hard to define. For Anna, this neutrality was precisely what was hardest to get used to. In the German system over the past few years, she had seen only two sharply contrasting attitudes: the coldness of superiors and the cruelty ascribed to the enemy by propaganda. Now she was faced with something entirely different, the outcome of a huge organization functioning in a purely mechanical way. Everything was done according to procedure without deviation for her identity, her gender, or her past. Breakfast was served at a simple canteen on the western side of the camp. A long line formed outside the door. Steam rose from the pots and dispersed into the morning air, carrying warmth and a light smell of beans. When Anna received a bowl of soup, she looked down to see slices of potato, bits of leafy greens, and several chewy pieces of meat. It was the first time in nearly half a year that she had seen meat. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the spoon. It was not hunger that made her shake, but a feeling she could not categorize, as if her body remembered the taste of meat, yet her mind did not dare admit that this was a normal meal. The moment the soup entered her mouth, she suddenly realized that every meal she had eaten in recent months had carried the taste of smoke and hardness. Now the warmth of the soup made her throat feel soft, and that softness briefly allowed her to reclaim the word ordinary. The camp's arrangements divided the female prisoners into different light labor groups. She was assigned to the wash area, responsible for cleaning and hanging to dry the towels, simple uniforms, and bedding used in the camp. Several diesel-powered washing machines stood there, humming with a steady vibration. The smell of diesel mixed with the odor of wet cloth was not pleasant, but to her it represented order. She loaded heaps of sopping fabric into the machines and pressed the switch, and the drums began to churn at once. That unchanging drone, oddly enough, gave her a long-lost sense of security, because it signified a daily life that was predictable and repeatable. In the war, she had never possessed such a sound. At the front and in the bunkers there had been only explosions, shouted orders, running footsteps and the clash of metal, never this kind of ordinary, seemingly insignificant mechanical noise. As she hung up one clean towel after another in the drying area, she noticed in the medical tent beside her that American nurses were checking disinfectants. On the table lay neatly arranged rolls of gauze, bottles of alcohol, and clipboards. The nurses recorded each prisoner's basic nutritional condition and dental issues, with each item carefully differentiated and fixed onto index cards without any ambiguity. Looking at those record cards, she suddenly felt a faint sense of unreality. That precision and categorization were features of civilization she had almost forgotten over the last 3 years. A system that still functioned normally. One that could create health files for strangers and maintain logistical structures to track weight changes and calorie intake for prisoners. These were things her own country could no longer provide in the final phase of the war. A few days later, she received notice that she was allowed to write a letter home. Each prisoner could send a limited number of short letters per month to be forwarded by the Swiss Red Cross. She wrote a few brief lines on the paper, telling her mother that she was still alive and under American supervision. She had expected that writing would stir her emotions, but when she actually picked up the pen, she felt a strange emptiness. It was not that she had nothing to say, but that the war had kept her emotional life under pressure and tension for so long that when she was suddenly allowed to express herself, she did not know where to begin. She stared at the page, the tip of the pen hovering over the blank space, and only with a slight exertion of her fingers did she manage to write those simple sentences. She realized that the hand with which she wrote had also become clean, the lines of her skin clearly visible in the morning light. At the end of the day, she returned to the barracks, where the shadows of the barbed wire divided the sunset into fragments on the wooden walls. The prisoner of war camp was still a place that restricted freedom, but Anna gradually came to understand that what was being restricted here was her movement, not her basic human perceptions. She could eat her fill, wash her skin, sleep on a dry bed, breathe air without the smell of mold, and feel a peculiar calm in the drying area as towels fluttered on the lines. That calm was not happiness. It was a process of being slowly drawn back toward reality after long-term suppression. The camp's rules made her realize that the Americans did not provide these things out of kindness, but because their entire system could sustain such standards. Her own country, by the end of the war, could no longer maintain even the most basic order. On the battlefield, civilization was not determined by slogans or flags, but by every detail that touched human beings. For Anna, these details allowed her to recognize once again that her body had weight, her existence had boundaries, and her life was no longer completely swallowed by mud, smoke, and despair. At the end of one such day, she sat on her bunk and placed the bar of soap, now thoroughly dry, in her palm. It had grown slightly translucent after several uses, yet the fragrance lingered. She could not explain why she kept seeking out that scent. She only knew that it was the one clue that allowed her to reconfirm her own existence amid the ruins of war. Closing her eyes gently, she let that fragrance blend with the fading sound of wind outside the wooden hut, and for the first time she formed a small but genuine question about the future. If the war ended, would she ever be able to have this scent again? Many years later, in the transcript of a post-war interview, Anna was asked what her most unforgettable memory was. People had assumed she would mention the moment of encirclement, the thirst and exhaustion of long marches, or the various dangers during the collapse of the front. But after a long silence, she gave an answer that almost stunned the interviewer. Soap. Her voice did not tremble, yet it carried a transparency that only those who had endured long periods of suppression could understand. She recalled that the bar of soap with its faint citrus scent was neither a gift nor a symbol of kindness. It was one of the rarest, simplest, and yet most powerful traces of civilization she had encountered in the war. It made her realize how accustomed she had grown to filth, dampness, and exhaustion, to the point that she had forgotten what clean skin felt like, and that fragrance could confirm she still belonged to the world. The interviewer wrote that she did not cry when she said this, but there was a certain indescribable light in her eyes, like that of someone who had walked back from somewhere far away and dark and suddenly saw a narrow passage leading to normal life. She explained that the pain of war did not only lie in making people bleed, but also in slowly making them forget who they were, forgetting the feel of their own bodies, the rhythm of their lives, and the sense of everyday existence. The collapse of civilization, she said, did not begin with grand buildings falling, but with the disappearance of the smallest, most personal sensations of cleanliness, warmth, and safety. When that bar of soap was placed in her hand, she suddenly understood that she was still someone who could be cleaned, cared for, and regarded as a person, rather than a shadow being worn away by the battlefield. The documentary's narration concludes in this way. What a war can destroy is not only cities, weapons, and institutions, but also the most basic capacities that allow people to remain human. Civilization is not always grand. It can hide in the steam of warm water, in the scent of an ordinary bar of soap, in the moment a person comes to recognize herself anew. Anna's story reminds us that peace is never an abstraction. It is made up of countless small, human, everyday details. Once those details are stripped away, people will, without realizing it, drift away from themselves. When they return, even if only in the form of a single bar of soap, they can enable someone numbed by war to feel the warmth of the world once more. All of this gives her memories a simple yet profound power. They do not tell of victory or defeat, nor of heroes, but of how one person in a time of extreme chaos managed to grasp the boundaries of civilization again. That bar of soap did not change the war, but on that day it allowed a young woman to remember that she was still human, and for that reason, Anna said, it was the day she most wanted to remember, and the day she most hoped others would remember in the entire war.